I have an announcement to make. In half a year, I have written half my book. Yes, I have finished 29 and a half chapters out of 38, and the rest is in detailed outline form. So I am well on track for finishing my draft by the end of this year. My book is a sci-fi space opera that takes place in a fictional universe where two human planets developed independently with no knowledge of one another. To explore this mystery, there are 3 viewpoint characters. One of them is a hero's journey adventure that feels kind of like fantasy. One of them is kind of like a horror comedy, and the last one is an interplanetary corporate government conspiracy mystery. If you want to read a sample chapter, you can check out my author's website in the description, and you can also find ways to support me. Now, I should mention that this is just the first draft, and it has a lot of things that need to be improved. There will be at least a second draft, maybe more, so sadly it won't be ready to read by this December. However, in celebration of this progress and for sticking with my goals up until now, I've decided to do a special video where I read your comments and respond to them. So let's get to it. We'll start with R. Connor commenting on multiverses. Why is it that when people imagine higher dimensions, it's a spatial dimension and not an extra time dimension? That is a great question, and the reason that I do spatial dimensions instead of time dimensions is because I have no clue what an extra time dimension will look like, or what the implications will be. I spent over 10 years training myself to visualize 4 dimensions and to understand it. If I wanted to add another time dimension to that, I would have to... Gosh, I don't even know where I'd start. I would probably have to relearn general relativity and then reconstruct general relativity using a new metric with 2 time dimensions, play around with the math in various scenarios, and in that process develop an intuition for what 2 time dimensions would look like. But honestly, right now, if I even try, I can't even imagine, because like, could you choose which time dimension you move forward in? Could you go like this way, staying in the present of one, and then that way, staying in the present of the other? I honestly have no idea. I would be so happy to watch a video by someone who understands what this would mean, but for me, I don't know. 50 comments on the 3 E's of world building. Can you look at AI safety? Now, AI safety is an idea that's brought up a whole lot in popular science media and by popular intellectuals. I personally have thought about it some, but I don't consider myself to be an expert by any means. So if I were to give my opinion, the first thing that I would say is we have to call into question the big Frankenstein narrative. The idea that we're creating something that is smarter and stronger than we are, and therefore it's going to see us as being in the way, and it's just going to get rid of those pesky humans and take the world for itself. I don't see that as inevitable. I am not particularly worried about it. Is it possible? Yeah, maybe. But what's far more interesting to me is how sticky this narrative is. This idea that we have to be afraid of this because it could be a monster that kills us. That is easy to believe because it's scary and it's the unknown. Which means we as responsible truth seekers have to be extra wary of it. So we acknowledge the idea and the possibility that it might exist, and we put safeguards in place so that it doesn't, but we don't treat it as inevitable. We don't treat it as something that scares us into doing what scared people do. I will say that for me, the most tangible AI risk is what AI is being used for right now, with ChatGPT being used to write articles on the internet. I mean, when was the last time that you searched for something on the internet and you saw an article on the front page of Google that looked really good? It looked like it answered your exact question, and you clicked on it and you got pages, thousands of words of garbage. What's happening here is that an online journalist, instead of doing their job, decided they wanted to make a quick buck. And so they told ChatGPT, write an article for me that has this subject line and is search engine optimized. That is, it has all the keywords in the right places so that it goes to the front page of Google. So then it gets to the front page of Google, people click on it, it has pages of garbage that is worthless to everybody, it wastes your time, but the person who solicited ChatGPT to write it gets money for the ads. Capitalism at its finest. My advice for AI safety is to just remember that we live in a world about humans, and to always keep in your mind that you're a human and humans are what's important. So you do your work remembering that there are people on the other side, you relate to the people around you, you live in the human world, and don't spend too much time in the world of algorithms and AI. ChatGPT says on Newton's laws of motion, force is a constant speed limit in resistance. Nothing stays still. Energy is constant in cold resistance. Equalization is in the distance of forward momentum. The size of the path of circulation determines the strength of the force fields. Smaller fields are stronger. Liquidity to illusionary solidity. Resistance is always equalization to mass. Mass fails in equalization to resistance because resistance equalization to distance is directed trajectories reducing distances of travel. Equalization is maintained in resistance of occupational space. Cold resistance. Sorry, ChatGPT, but it takes more than putting thematically relevant words in grammatically correct sentences to be an expert. Photographo Sinistro asks on hyperspace, so is there a connection between what Buddha talked about nirvana and the concept of hyperspace? I don't think so. My understanding is that Buddhism takes for granted a certain view of cosmology and metaphysics, which is that the soul is in an eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This cycle of life and rebirth is seen as suffering, and only by becoming enlightened can we reach nirvana, which is leaving the cycle of rebirth, and therefore ending our suffering for eternity. Hyperspace, on the other hand, is in the Newtonian Einsteinian tradition of physics and describes another dimension of space, or of time, as R. Connor pointed out. This higher dimension would be of impact because it would fit into the equations of physics and would be a feature of the physical universe independent of whatever metaphysical truth there is about souls. Joey Vo says, loving your videos. I go to your playlists and let them play all night. Could you make a playlist with all your vids by chance? Well, Joey Vo, that's very nice, and thank you for the engagement. I have no plans on creating a playlist with all my videos, but you are more than welcome to do so yourself. JF Crow asks on consciousness, panpsychism, how is your view different from it, or is it? So panpsychism, as I understand it, is a tradition of philosophy, maybe spirituality, I'm not sure, that says that all of reality is consciousness. And I believe it's even that there is one consciousness that pervades all of reality. In more recent years, there's been a movement among some materialist philosophers in a direction that is a kind of panpsychism. The views of David Chalmers that perhaps the fundamental particles of matter, like electrons, have not only mass, spin, and energy, etc., but also an additional property which is consciousness. And obviously, electrons are not conscious like you and I are conscious, but they have within them a property that when combined with many, many other particles, such as in our brains, will lead to consciousness as we know it. My view that I outlined in the consciousness video, in a nutshell, is the idea that if there's a question between what is more real, consciousness or matter, matter is a concept, and reality is not a concept. But consciousness is not a concept. Consciousness is something that we experience directly about reality. Therefore, whatever reality is, consciousness is a part of it. Matter is only a description. I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm a panpsychist, because I'm not committing to the idea that everything is consciousness. My position is that whatever reality is, at least some of it is consciousness. That doesn't rule out the possibility that there's other stuff out there that is not consciousness. I mean, just think about a rock. Think about what kind of consciousness the matter of a rock is made of. You know, a rock doesn't see anything, it doesn't hear anything, it doesn't think anything, it doesn't have a perception of time. Now, in its fundamental ontology, is it conscious-like? Is it the same type of thing as consciousness? Well, maybe, but if it doesn't have any of the features that we associate with consciousness, then it may be just as correct to say it is something other than consciousness. 50 on Quantum 1 says, coherence is a somewhat overused term. It seems to mean different things to different people. How do you see it? then how does the collapse of one qubit remove itself from the universal waveform? I don't expect you to know the definitive how, but can you talk to the decomposition of the vector products or decoherence, whatever that is? So I believe the question you're getting at, 50, is the question of what interpretation is the truest interpretation of quantum physics. And I did a video on that, so you can check this one out. Basically, there are two major contenders. There is the universal waveform / many worlds interpretation, which says that for every time the wave function collapses, it doesn't really collapse. It's just that the consistency of the universe requires there to be two parallel realities on top of each other, where this thing happens in one universe and the opposite happens in the other universe. The other major interpretation is the objective collapse interpretation, which is that there's only one universe, and when a wave function collapses, the information that was in the other parts of the wave function vanishes from reality. And of course, these two interpretations have vastly different implications. However, right now we do not have the ability to test which one might be more true than the other. Objective collapse takes the apparent results of the experiments to their ultimate conclusion. Many worlds takes the math to its ultimate conclusion. As to coherence, coherence is a term that we use when talking about waves. When two waves are on top of each other, they're coherent if they have the same phase. That is, if the peaks of one wave align with the peaks of the other wave and the valleys of one wave align with the valleys of the other wave. When this happens, they constructively interfere with each other to make a stronger wave. The same logic applies to quantum physics, where we have particles and groups of particles that act together as waves. If enough of the wave functions are in sync, in phase, that means they're more likely to add up together to superimpose with constructive interference. If the phases of the wave functions are all over the place, then they sort of just add up to a smear of canceling out and there's nothing really there. So when quantum decoherence happens, we get basically disentangled particles. As for a qubit removing itself from the universal waveform, a qubit is really something that is used in quantum computing, and I don't know very much about quantum computing. It's using quantum physics in computers, but basically I'm guessing that you mean a particle disentangling itself from the rest of the universe, in which case I'm honestly not quite that sure because this is not my area of expertise. Wizard CS2ST says on magic, magic is defined as the supernatural, and therefore it can never exist because the moment something exists, it exists in the natural world, and therefore it is natural. Checkmate, I win. Yes, indeed, you do win. You get a gold star. It is true that if you define something as impossible to exist, then it doesn't exist. That is a question of definitions, not a question of whatever it is that we are talking about. When I made this video, I really wanted to ask the philosophical question of what even is magic in the first place? And why do we say that when we understand something, it's not magic? And how can I, as an author, make my sci-fi and fantasy stories feel magical? So there's a lot of different perceptions of what magic is supposed to be. Some of it is just alternative science that we find in science fiction and fantasy. Another concept of magic is an alt-spiritual tradition that sort of exists underground among the overarching spiritual tradition of a society. For instance, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, magic had to do with the tradition of witchcraft and secret knowledge and astrology. Very different from the metal ingesting and whatnot we find in certain modern fantasy novels. So my personal concept of magic is something along the lines of forces that work underground and counter to, but also sort of in tandem with the modern view of the world, which is modernist scientism. And the magic of today is powers, social forces, postmodernism, but also the phenomenon that you learning ideas and gaining new perspective can lead you to change your life and as a result view the universe in a completely different way. Even though the universe didn't change, your perspective on everything, the meaning of life, your place in the world, what there is to experience in life can change, not by the facts of something outside of you changing, but by something inside you changing, by learning, by changing your mind, by building habits, and by influencing and being influenced by others. Andrea Horst on Truth says, maybe you could do a video on what is an idea. After all, ideas are not physical in any way, yet they can have great impacts in reality on large numbers of people. Where do they come from, and why are they so powerful? Yeah, well, we could start by talking about the physics of ideas. An idea is something that exists inside your brain as a pattern of neural pathways. When those neural pathways are active, you're thinking about the idea. Ideas are communicated by the information in those patterns going into your nerves, going into the vibrations in the air, coming into somebody else's nerves, and then constructing neural pathways in their brains. And because the way our brains work is that everything is connected to everything else in a way that is unique to every person, everyone's idea is a little bit different. It is always constructed a little bit differently in everybody who hears it and everybody who thinks it. How do ideas spread and how are they so powerful? I talked about that a little bit in my video on evolution. Basically, ideas are a type of mimetic complex. Okay, that's a fancy word. What does it mean? The foundational building blocks of an idea are called memes. And I don't just mean pictures with captions that get shared on the internet, although those are a valid type of meme in the traditional scientific sense. A fashion trend is a meme, a quote that sticks is a meme, a logical argument is a meme, and when all these things come together into a narrative, that is called a mimetic complex. And it functions somewhat like an organism, an abstract idea organism. Society is to mimetic complexes like the physical world is to life. It's an environment on which genes and memes are naturally selected. And no, it is not a marketplace of ideas where the most logical ideas rise to the top. Mimetic complexes are naturally selected based on how sticky their memes are. What makes a meme sticky? Well, it's something that is memorable, something that is believable, something that is repeatable. So if we're afraid of something, that makes that meme stickier. If we want to believe something, if we crave something, if we desire something, that makes the meme sticky. And different memes are stickier to different people. If we're very logical thinkers, then more logical memes are sticky. If we follow a tradition, then memes that align with that tradition are sticky. And also, something can be sticky if we see or hear it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And there are probably many other factors that determine whether memes are sticky or not. But yeah, you have a good point. Maybe after I think about it for another few years, I will make a video on this. Pedro EXP on postmodernism says, I never really understood postmodernism outside the propaganda of it ruining Western culture, so thanks for the explanation. Yeah, and piggybacking off the previous comment about ideas, postmodernism is in fact slammed a whole lot by modernism. And that is because modernism is a meta-narrative. Not only that, it has what's called hegemony. That means modernism is dominant and it controls society. Postmodernism is a criticism of aspects of modernism. And so modernism, if we're thinking of it as an organism, is reacting and basically using intellectuals as an immune system to try to beat back the invasive postmodern ideas. And if we look at the philosophy of postmodern thinkers, this makes sense. Foucault criticized our ideas of punishment and prison, and Derrida criticized the idea of truth being found in logic and language. These ideas are threatening to modernism being the dominant animal at the top of the food chain. As for me, the reason I got interested in postmodern ideas is because I heard public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson saying, don't listen to those people are bad, don't listen to them. So naturally I went and looked up what they had to say. Chris Gilfillan on Free Will says, there really is no debate. Any decision you make is the only possible decision you could make, given everything that you are at that moment. All things being equal, that same decision would be made 100% of the time. Therefore, free will is just not possible, logically. Now, this is a symptom of someone who has not bothered to pay attention to what the other side is saying. simply believing that because the logic makes sense to them, they must be right. Free will is a theory of human behavior. It is not a theory of physics. It is so far removed up the scale of emergence from foundational quantum physics. We talked about how the macroscopic world emerges from quantum physics in this video, so let's talk about emergence a little bit. The neurons of the brain are kind of like a bunch of switches that are connected to each other. Now you look at a few switches and you see them flipping and they're connected to the other switches. They're flipping based on what the switches around them are doing, and you say, well, obviously there's no free will there. We can predict that this one is going to flip 3 seconds from now, 5 seconds from now, and 10 seconds from now based on the math of what all the other things are doing. But if you scale that up to billions and billions of switches, which are all connected to each other and all have different criteria for how they flip, and the system as a whole is interacting with the outside, taking in information and putting out information, then it's completely reasonable that something that is accurately modeled by the theory of free will emerges. And this would be true in a supernatural universe, it would be true in a quantum universe, and it would also even be true in a Newtonian clockwork universe. So you can say free will doesn't exist, but you'll want to be consistent and say that other things like computers and tables and houses and people don't exist. Stephen G. on free will says, "My own guess is that the as yet unknown physical laws of our local universe arise so as to allow consciousness and free will to exist." Well, Stephen G., you don't need to make any changes to the laws of physics as we know it to allow consciousness and free will to exist. It is perfectly reasonable that they could both exist on higher level emergent layers of reality, supervening on quantum physics, or even Newtonian clockwork physics. Arabocal's Athanatos on magic says, "The problem is that magic and science are two halves of one whole. For reality is shaped by the beliefs for the gods and of those which were created in the image of the gods. But because ever fruitful humans live in a physical world, the power of physical law grows ever stronger because of them, and divine law fades away. But if, or should I say, when, the knowledge of the physical world fades, divine law shall reign anew." Well, Arabocal's Athanatos, I'm not sure what tradition you're coming from, so I don't feel like I can really speak to what you're intending to communicate. But that does bring up something interesting to talk about. There was a time before anyone, even philosophers and the wisest people in existence, knew that the world could be described scientifically. In that time, everything was perceived through the lens of meaning. A rainbow was a sign from God. A great stone stood over the village as a protector, put there by the spirits of the ancient ancestors. We don't think that way nearly as much anymore, but there will come a time when all of the interesting questions of science have been answered, and there will be no physical mystery left in the universe. And I find it fascinating to imagine what life would be like in such a post-scientistic society. I've even contemplated doing a whole video on post-scientism. One of the books I plan to write someday takes place 1,000,000 years in the future where all scientific questions have been answered and all useful technology has been invented. World building this type of society, I found, is a very fun and interesting activity. I imagine that once the fervor of science no longer has a purpose in society, we will once again look at the universe through the lens of meaning and myth. Delta X Music on Hyperspace says, "Love your enthusiasm, brother. 4D travel happens in the mind, baby." So that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and to those of you who have subscribed, thanks for coming along with me on this journey and being patient while I figure out what I'm doing with this channel. Here's to another half a year and another productive half draft of writing. If you'd like a chance to be featured in the next comment response video, tell me your thoughts below and hit the like button. That's it for today. I'll see you next time.